Welcome back to Pace Immigration, paceimmigration.com. Talking once again with immigration lawyer Andy Semichuk. Andy, good to see you. Today we're going to talk about something that's in the news. It's actually big news, and it's the Ukraine.
Yes.
Take us through what's going on over there and how it might impact people who wish to immigrate to Canada from there.
Okay, all right. Well, perhaps we should start with a little primer as to, for those people who may not know much about Ukraine, just so we're on the same page. Ukraine is next door to Russia, obviously. That's where the problems are. Also next door to Poland, just north of Turkey, for those people who don't know where it is. It's about 40 million people. And the country is essentially Western Ukrainian-speaking, Eastern Russian-speaking, and the ties are closer to Europe in the west than they are to Russia in the east.
Okay.
That's the lay of the land. And just by way of background in terms of what's going on, Russia appears to be invading Ukraine. They've already occupied Crimea, and it looks like they're going to be heading for eastern Ukraine and probably trying to invade and occupy all of Ukraine. So that's what's in the news. By way of background, Ukraine has had the misfortune over, 1,000 years or so of being a neighbor to Russia, and Russia has generally been aggressive, and in large part through all that time, it's been Ukraine has been subordinated to Russia, either under Tsarist Russia or the Soviet Union, and now with Putin. In terms of what's going on, people likely are going to be facing either occupation, being under Russian control, or fleeing, possibly refugees going to Poland, and anybody who can possibly making their way to Canada or the United States. If they are fleeing and they end up in Poland, they would end up being people who are outside their normal country of residence and therefore eligible to apply for refugee status.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Andy, let's
Sure.
go over that really quickly, because I know I get emails on Facebook and things where I don't think people fully understand. You can't apply for refugee status while you're in the country you're seeking refugee status from.
Correct.
So in other words, a Ukrainian can't say, I want to be a refugee from Ukraine if they're in Ukraine.
Correct, yeah, because the definition of refugee is someone who is outside their normal country of citizenship and is in fear of persecution. So, for example, Syrians in Syria cannot, even though they're in the midst of a civil war, apply to be a refugee to come to Canada, and similarly Ukrainians will be in the same boat.
Right.
But if they are outside, then they can, but the difficulty is they need to gain certification from the United Nations Commission on Refugee Status that they are refugees before they would be accepted into Canada as refugees. If you're in Canada as a visitor, for example, right now, and these events have broken out, you could claim refugee status in Canada directly, just by going to immigration and claiming that you are a refugee and you have a good, well-founded fear of persecution if you are returned back to Ukraine.
Now, if somebody hears that and thinks, okay, then I'm going to get on a plane, fly to Canada, say I'm a visitor, and then claim refugee status, it's probably not going to work out that easily, is it?
Well, it won't, because you're going to need a visa to come to Canada from Ukraine. So nobody's going to get on a plane and come here.
Right.
It's either going to be people who are visiting from Ukraine here now and who cannot return, possibly people who have been here for some time, who have perhaps come illegally and have been in Canada. They may become eligible as refugees if they can show that their return is impossible because they fear persecution. So they have to have some reason, some good reason for why they're afraid to return to Ukraine, other than, it's just been invaded by Russia.
So let's go over that a little bit.
All right.
So it's not like the Canadian government then assigns refugee status to an entire country, say.
No.
They don't say that just because this country's in turmoil, that does not mean that everyone from there that's in Canada is now a refugee.
Right.
Okay.
Right. They have categories of countries that are refugee-producing countries, and therefore the people who make refugee claims from those countries are going to be given more of a hearing and more likely accepted as refugees. So, for example, if someone comes from the United States to Canada, it's unlikely that such a claim is going to be successful, and so they're not going to be as likely to get a full hearing and go through the whole process as someone who might come from Ukraine now.
Right.
But there's no such thing as a carte blanche. Anybody who shows up from a country is a refugee.
And the standard things apply. So it's a fear of persecution on the basis of what? Politics, race, religion, sex,
yes.
things like this?
Gender,
okay.
yes.
Okay.
Social standing and so on. But let me just add this. So at the moment, let's say you're Ukrainian and you're looking to come to Canada, and you're not in Canada but somewhere overseas, either in Ukraine or outside of Ukraine in one of the countries like in Europe.
Right.
In such instances, you're going to need a visa to get here. So the non-immigrant categories, such as student, visitor, and so on, are going to unlikely be ways to come to Canada in the near foreseeable future, because if you're from Ukraine, it's very unlikely you're going to return back to Ukraine if you come to Canada as a visitor or as a student or even as a temporary worker. So I would say those avenues are closed. If you're in Europe, if you're legally in Europe and you're coming to Canada as a visitor, that's a different story. If you're illegally in Europe, no way to come to Canada as an illegal or a temporary visitor or any other temporary status. So at the moment, the only people who could likely come to Canada or the United States for that matter are people who could establish some reason why they would come permanently. So for example, if you're married to a Canadian or an American, for example, that would be one way. Or you're a close family member, such as a son, daughter, parent, or whatever, that category would be possible. Also, if, for example, you have a job offer that has been granted a labor market opinion because there's a scarcity of your type of workers in Canada, for example, a speech therapist. In that instance, you could come to Canada based on a permanent application. But the problem with permanent applications is they do not address the immediate need of people, which is to get the heck out of there and come to a safe place.
So if you were a Ukrainian in Ukraine and really wanted to get out of there and wanted to follow, some legal means eventually, I guess, I don't know. What's your advice to someone that's just sitting there in Ukraine and they need to get out now?
All right. If there's someone in immediate danger, for example, someone who is a political leader, someone who is a leader in the police or in the military, and they want to get out, and they want to get out because the Russians are coming, of course, the first thing is go to any country that does not require a visa to fly out. So, for example, I've had clients who have flown to Beijing, China. It's not in the direction of the West, but at least it's a place where evidently you can fly or go without any problems in terms of immigration or whatever.
So a Ukrainian going to Beijing is not unlike a Canadian going to the United States.
Right.
They just cross the border.
Right,
Okay.
right. So far as I understand.
Okay.
And so any country, perhaps Poland or whatever, to get away from the immediate danger involved that you obviously will face if the Russians come in and occupy the country.
Right.
Following that, you can then think about making some applications to come to Canada. If you have family, if you have work, okay, those would be normal applications that would go through the Canadian consulate wherever you are outside of Ukraine. If you're a refugee or if you fear persecution, then your next step is to contact the United Nations Commission on Refugees to see if you can be certified as a refugee. In other words, it's an application first to the UN to be established as a refugee. And then once you're established as a refugee, steps can be taken to bring you into Canada. There's a program where 5 Canadians can sponsor a refugee to come to Canada, given that the person is certified as a refugee. But the process begins where you are outside of the country of origin.
Right. One thing we should back up on, too, that stuff about flying to China and not needing it, all this could change tomorrow.
Of course, yeah.
Because the world events are going to take over and countries get nervous about an influx of refugees, things like that.
Yes,
So.
yeah. Just I want to comment on that. This time is a very insecure time, not only for Ukrainians, but for all people in Europe and even outside of Europe, places like Japan and so on, because the normal guarantees, security guarantees that nations gave to one another have been upset by this development, these political developments in Ukraine. So countries like the Baltic states are also now nervous about what could happen next in terms of Putin's efforts.
Right.
And they're going to be facing the same kind of immigration issues that we talked about with Ukrainians if Putin moves in that direction.
Okay. Any and all questions? Andy Semichuk, so you can reach him at asemichuk@pacelawfirm.com. You can also find him at myworkvisa.com for any questions about what we just talked about, and get in touch, yeah?
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks,
Thank
Andy, and bye for now.